Could I call the chamber to order? Good afternoon and welcome to the debate chamber for the last debate of today. The motion before the House this afternoon is this House believes that schools should teach national values over global ones. Very interesting topic which we're going to get onto as soon as we can. Before we start, I'd like to ask you to all vote on which way you would like to support this motion. You'll each have on your seats in your hand somewhere near a small box here, which you can use to vote. What I'd like to do is ask you, I'm going to read the motion again, and I'm going to read the motion again, and then I'm going to ask you to press A if you are for the motion, B if you are against the motion, and C if you are undecided even. I hope you're all undivided by the end. This House believes that schools should teach national values over global ones. Please press A for, B against, or C if you are undecided. You have 10 seconds to make your choice, and every vote until then counts. Okay, so we've got quite a clear pattern there. Let's see what happens. We've obviously got a lot to talk about. So we have four very eminent speakers for you this afternoon to discuss this motion. For the motion, we have Lutfi Siddiqui, who is visiting professor at the London School of Economics and adjunct professor at the National University of Singapore. And we have Michael Gove, the former Secretary of State for Education in the UK. Against the motion on the opposite side here, we have the Honourable Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia and Chair of the Global Partnership for Education. And we have Dr. Emiliana Vegas, who is Chief of Education Division at the Inter-American Development Bank. Please welcome our speakers. So this afternoon, we're going to ask our colleagues on the right to propose the motion for 7 minutes, and then the opposition to speak against the motion for 7 minutes. We'll then repeat that with the other speaker. I'll then open the floor for questions, so please do think about any points that you want to make and any questions that you have for our speakers. So we'll have 15 minutes. I'll then ask each of the speakers on each side, so 3 minutes per side, with the lead on each side to summarise for 3 minutes, and then we'll have another vote and see how our bars have changed. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Lutfi Siddiqui to propose the motion.
Thank you. Do I call you Madam Speaker? Thank you, Madam
like.
Speaker. And thank you all of you for being here. This is both a difficult and an easy argument for me to make. It's difficult for a couple of reasons. Firstly, some of the arguments that I'm going to make have been made in the last couple of years, unfortunately, by pretty unsavory characters around the globe. And it's very hard for me to urge people to focus on my content and my concerns without sounding like an apologist for those characters. But I'll try. But unfortunately, for those of us on this side of the argument, we don't have the looks of a Trudeau or the eloquence of an Obama or the grace of a Julia. But we'll try. It's also difficult because this debate seems to attract labels very quickly, whether it's racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, parochialism. The isms and the phobias they come fast and quick, and I hope that we'll avoid those today. But it's really easy also for me because it's just a matter of posing the question, what exactly are global values? And I think the answer is simple. Global values are my values. Any value that I hold dear, I would like to claim are global values. And any values that you hold that I may not agree with cannot be global values. That's really the definition. I mean, it's absurd to ask people to say, you know, I hold these values dear to my heart. My family feels the same way. But those values are certified global, and therefore those are superior, and mine are inferior. I mean, who says that? Proponents of global values not only believe that their own values should be global values, but I think they also believe that their values should be imposed as global values. And there's almost an imperialist, evangelical, supremacist thrust to that strand. I mean, do you really believe that value sets are universal? What do you think of capital punishment, for example? Do you all agree on that? What do you think of liberal democracy versus other forms of governance? Do we have agreement on that? Singapore. Singapore has an estate management policy, accommodation management policy, where they have racial quotas of who can stay in which buildings, and I happen to like it. I think it's better than the mono-ethnic housing estates you have in France. And it's because I clearly value racial harmony over the bit of intrusion that that policy entails. Caring for the elderly. They give tax breaks if you live close to your parents. I don't think we'd be able to do that in the UK. So, what about neckties and high heels and hijabs? Should we ban hijabs, for example? Just a couple of days ago, I saw the European Court of Justice rule that symbols of religion can be barred from the workplace. And one of the British members of Parliament, a Remain voter, got up and said this is not part of British values. So I think, Madam Speaker, it's a myth, it's a convenient myth that the globe shares universal values. But even if that were to be the case, we need to rank weights, rank values. So if your list of values and my list of values happen to have a few items that coincide, it's not likely that you will rank them in the same way that I would rank them. So when a real trade-off presents itself, that's really when your values are tested. And that's where these motherhood apple pie statements don't hold water. Thirdly, values are contextual. They don't live in a vacuum. It matters whether you're at a subsistence level of poverty or at a Switzerland level of prosperity. I was speaking to a Canadian Jewish friend of mine recently, and she said that the values that her community hold in Montreal are not identical to the ones that they hold in Israel, because she says the context is different. In one case, it's more hostile, it's more crowded. That's an important one. Population density has a bearing on how generous you can be with your values. Australia has a population the size of Mumbai. The population density is less than 3 per square kilometers. Bangladesh has 1,300 people. So I would argue on a density-weighted basis, Australia is a rather unwelcoming country. So if values are not universal, if they're relative and they're contextual, then what on earth are these global values that you want us to prioritize over national values? Pushing for global is such a bankrupt concept. I mean, look at what's the title of this year's forum? It's how do we make real global citizens? I mean, if that is not an acknowledgement that what we have right now are fake global citizens, I don't know what is. And this fakery might be well-meaning. It might be rooted in idealism. But at times it does feel like it's really a little militant. It's the thrusting down our throats of this liberal ideology that seems to have prevailed for a while. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a British Bangladeshi, Muslim, married to a Christian Singaporean of Chinese descent. I was born in Bangladesh, went to school for a bit, then I went to primary school not too far from here in the United Arab Emirates, a Catholic school run by nuns. I did my O-levels in Namibia, Southwest Africa at the time. I went to international college in Wales. I went to university in England, where I was elected president of the International Student Association. I worked in London and Zurich for 10 years in Singapore. I don't think there's anyone here who can claim to be more of a global citizen than myself. And even then, in spite of that, or perhaps because of that, I am in favor of this motion. I think there's a problem that we are in denial. We are in denial about those NHS doctors who voted for Brexit. I voted Remain, but they voted for Brexit. Those white women who did not vote for Hillary Clinton, they're not a stupid fringe. There's something going on there that we failed to engage. And I think it's to do with this thrust for globality.
30 seconds, please.
Okay. So what I'll say is we were asked to do, those of us who had the privilege of being exposed to the global world were asked to go and disseminate the benefit of that to the rest of the people. We've instead created a sliver of uber elites who thrive on exclusivity, who keep on adding global titles, who are on global platforms, fighting global climate agenda, global gender issues, and forgetting things in our own backyard. And that needs to be reset, which is why we need to reinforce national values over global ones. Thank you.
Julie Gillard, can I ask you to respond?
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. I haven't given a speech in a parliamentary setting for quite a long time. When I last gave a speech in a parliamentary setting, perhaps the most famed one was the misogyny speech, and so it is with a great sense of delight that I'm here for the girls' team against the boys' team today. And to my friend from the boys' team who's made a reflection about my country, Australia, there is a piece of outback Australia with no water but plenty of poisonous snakes and spiders waiting for you. No problems at all. We can absolutely organise that. And on this question of real global citizens and fake global citizens, I did think to myself, are the fake global citizens the ones who are carrying on about the fake facts? But we will leave all of that there, the fake news. What I wanted to do was to take us outside this chamber, and in doing so I'm really going to set the scene for Michael Gove's speech when he gives it after me. I'm going to ask you to imagine something that is really unimaginable. I'm going to ask you to imagine a different history for last century. I'm particularly going to ask you to imagine that the Nazis won World War II. And so I'm going to take us through an exercise about global values and national values in that context. Where would Michael Gove be today if that had happened, if the Nazis had won World War II? Well, clearly he'd be fighting for the resistance in the United Kingdom, channeling his best inner James Bond, thinking about himself as a Daniel Craig-style figure as he went about fighting fascism in his own land. And when he finally got to put his head down at night in some godforsaken safe house, hoping that it did remain safe for the remainder of the evening, he would be thinking to himself about what he was fighting for. And maybe he would be thinking, what I'm fighting for is the right of a man in the United Kingdom to do British things, to go to the pub, to watch the football, to have a curry on the way home. That is what I am fighting for. And maybe a French member of the resistance would go to sleep thinking he's fighting to enjoy the Moulin Rouge without any fear of violence. An Italian might say he wanted to walk around Rome no longer seeing Nazi symbols but just seeing the beauty. But perhaps behind all of that national dreaming, there would be some joined up things that these fighters for freedom would all be dreaming of in the evening. A life of peace without warfare, a life of freedom, a life without discrimination against them, a life in which they would have a say in the future. And in fact, this very chamber that we're standing in is modelled on the great chambers in the world that in their very design have got those values captured. The government and the opposition more than 2 sword lengths apart, so that the very design of the chamber could say, we will resolve disputes with words, no longer with violence. Chambers that allow everybody in that nation to exercise a vote as to who should go there, the poorest and the richest, each getting 1 ballot paper so they could have a say. Now, what are these impulses that would be there across our freedom fighters? I think they are impulses that are best summed up as global values, the instincts within us as human beings to seek out the universal and the truthful. And we know when we see an offence against those values that it is an offence, and the world has in the past come together to fight such offences. When we joined together to fight against the apartheid system of South Africa, when we joined together in horror at the shooting of Malala, this, I think, is an expression of what it is to be human and the kind of values that unite us. In fact, Michael, even though he will speak on the other side of this debate, is someone who has seen these universal values and not only wanted to expound them, but has wanted to be part of seeing them brought to other places around the earth. He said this about the Iraq War, a controversial topic, but this is Michael's quote. There is a chance, he said, following the war, to redraw the map of the Middle East in order to ensure that the values of liberty, which I regard as universal, have a chance to take root. The value of liberty, which I regard as universal. And Michael's right about that. There are global values, things that we all aspire to. There is a belief in the universal. Now, perhaps it could be said that really there is no conflict then between national values and global values because human beings all have the same impulses. But we do know that in our world there have been times when those values have been in conflict. And it has always been a question of judgment about how the world deals with that. Does it just deal with it through advocacy? Does it deal with it through the use of diplomatic power? Does it deal with it through soft diplomatic power or the use of hard power? These are always difficult decisions to make, and I don't try and pretend that they are simple ones. But our world has come together and sought to reduce through various instruments the sense of what it is to be human and to yearn for freedom. And that is what the Declaration of Human Rights is about. It's what the rights of the child, the covenant that spells out how we would want every child on the planet to be dealt with, is about. It's actually fundamentally what the Sustainable Development Goals are about, what we would aspire for every human being on this planet. Now, the fact that we cannot reduce every human impulse into an agreed piece of writing doesn't mean that there's no such thing as global values. It means that there are some things on which we will quickly agree and some things that we will continue to debate. We shouldn't be afraid of that, and we shouldn't say because we don't quickly agree on everything that a sense of global values cannot exist. I think there are core global values that we can all say, yes, I would agree with that. To take one example, if there was a nation on earth that decided today to enslave a part of its population based on race, to mimic what slavery used to be in the United States of America before abolition, if that happened today, I think citizens around the world would say that that is an offence against human beings, it is an offence against global values. And in our own way and with our own capabilities, we would join together to try and eradicate something as offensive as slavery, the buying and selling of human beings from the face of this earth. And so, if we can agree that there is an impulse within us to seek out the universal, if we can agree that there are global values which can bind us and unite us, then surely we should be teaching those values to our children, because the world in which they live will increasingly be a world where the choices are more complex, less defined by national boundaries than they've ever been before, and ones where these global values will always be to the fore. Now, that doesn't mean that a man in the United Kingdom isn't going to want to go to the pub, have a pint and have a curry on the way home, having watched the football, but it does mean that he can be guided by global values as he does so. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much, Julia Gard. Okay, I'm sorry, my timer must be out. Apologies. Michael Gove.
Can I say what a pleasure it is to be here, to be on the same side as Professor Siddiqui, and in particular, to speak after Julia. She was an outstanding Prime Minister of Australia and a great education reformer, but today she revealed a hitherto hidden talent. Probably the most imaginative casting director in the history of the Bond franchise. Sean Connery, Roger Moore, Daniel Craig, and then me. I have to say, Julia, you exhibited there, with that generosity of spirit, something that Australian women have always exhibited now for decades, which is the capacity to take an unappealing piece of masculinity and nevertheless to say something nice about it. And can I say as well that it's a privilege to be on the male side against the female side, because I know from the vote that we had earlier that we boys are up against it. Because it's a truth, isn't it, that the countries that are doing best in the world at the moment, whether it's Germany or Britain, are countries that are led by women. It's countries that recently had a choice as to whether or not they were going to have a woman leader that may have occasion, I'm not mentioning any names, to revisit that question and wonder if they got it wrong. So all I will say is that the other side have a natural advantage because the empirical evidence of what's happening in real nation states at the moment shows you're better off trusting a woman's judgment than a man's ego. But nevertheless, I'm on this side. And one of the reasons that I'm on this side is because, of course, like Julia, like all of you, I recognize, as Professor Siddiqui pointed out, that there are some values which I suspect almost all of us share. But those values are often best passed on through the medium of a nation state. Now, that's not to say that there aren't global or universal values. And indeed, our side of the motion would say that we're not rejecting them. We're not saying that they should be driven to the margins, just that national values have a special place in education. Why? Because nation states, liberal, democratic nation states, have been the best means so far by which mankind has actually ensured that the values that I suspect most of us share have actually been made real. Whenever we've had pretensions for global organizations, whether it's been the Roman Empire or the British Empire or any empire, no matter how enlightened the individuals thought they were in bringing peace and civilization and railways and tiffin and cake at four to other countries, actually the reality of empire, all empire, is that it has involved exploitation, ugliness, greed, and hypocrisy. And it's also the reality of all nation states that whenever we've had democracies, whenever we've had systems whereby leaders can be held accountable and then kicked out when they're corrupt or wicked or evil or get things wrong, it's always been within the boundaries of nation states. More than that, as Professor Siddiqui pointed out, we on this side welcome ethnic diversity. We believe that societies gain from having people who have different cultures and different backgrounds. But the best way to ensure that people from different cultures and backgrounds and faiths and perspectives can work together is within the family, the shared home that is the nation state. If you have a large borderless entity, if you have an attempt to shoehorn different peoples into one empire, not just a British, but for that matter, a Soviet one, then what you get is ethnic strife and division and ideological conflict. But in countries like Australia, or Singapore, or Britain, or America, or Argentina, what you see there are people who come from a huge variety of backgrounds. Is because of Britain's traditions, because of Australia's parliamentary democracy, because of Singapore's strong secular government, because of Argentina's melting pot culture, that you've had people who can freely worship Allah, or celebrate Diwali, or go to a synagogue in peace, and at the same time use the same currency, pay the same taxes, obey the same laws, and also know that their children in the same schools are learning the same values of respect. And critically also, there is a danger at the moment in education. And that danger is that too much attention and honor is paid to the hyper-successful in education. I was an education minister, as Julia was, who wanted children to succeed and celebrated success. I want more children to go to university, to be able to shape the world on the basis of their abilities and their ideas. But there is a danger globally at the moment that some of those who succeed through education and hard work, and who therefore rise to the top in a meritocracy, believe that everything is down to their own unaided efforts, and nothing is down to those who are their brothers and sisters in the same country. And the danger is that those people become part of a global elite, sealed off from the country from which they sprang. So they feel at home in first-class lounges. They feel at home, if I may say so, in international global fora. But what they often forget is the virtues that they learned at home. And what they often forget are the people left back home, who don't perhaps have the advantages, the connections, and the qualifications to be able to compete on that global stage. And one of the challenges that we all face now is to make sure that in all our homes, that we work together, that those who are poorer, those who are left behind, those who haven't leapt over the digital divide, feel that we care about them and their future, that we're going to work hard to make sure that they have jobs, prospects for their children, and a chance to belong. So in asking that we should celebrate national values, we're not asking that you should be exclusive. We're asking that you should celebrate the best and most successful inclusive institutions there are, nation states. And when those nation states work together, when countries like Britain, Australia, America, Singapore, and Argentina work together, then we can help those developing nation states to themselves grow tall, to join a broad family in which each individual nation is owed respect, and each individual citizen within each nation knows that they are valued. That's the model of progress that has worked in the past. I think it's the best model for the future, and it's one that I believe can inspire our children if we have the confidence to make that case in the years ahead. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael Gove. Just before I move on to our last speaker, I'd like to remind you that I'm going to open the floor to questions, so please do have a think about the things you'd like to ask these speakers. Emiliana Vegas.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to come after these amazing speakers. Can you hear me okay? I'd like to start by saying that I agree with Mr. Gove. I agree that these two proposals of having national values or global values are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they can reinforce each other. The problem I have with this argument is that he posed it as if global values mean that there will be an empire versus national values meaning that nation states. And I don't think those are mutually exclusive or even similar. I think that an empire is not anything we want, but yet as individual states, we can agree on common values that will guide all of us to respect each other, tolerate each other, and also to protect this planet that we share. So I'd like to give you a little bit of my own personal history. I'm from a country called Venezuela, which is a nation state, as you would say, and embarked in a path about 16 years ago of teaching national values. And through a very authoritarian regime, now has one of the, in spite of highest natural resources in the world, poorest individuals in the world, where there's oppression, where there is no free media, and where people through the education system in the many years that the regime has been in place have not learned the skills they need to be able to succeed in Venezuela or elsewhere. So I would claim that it is important for us as a community of like-minded individuals who share the values of respect for each other, tolerance of each other, and respect for the environment, that we work hard, as my teammate expressed, in defining and identifying a set of global values that all nation states commit to imparting in their education systems, because they will equip all of our children for generations to come to be respectful of different ideas, of different religions, of different cultures, of different ways to dress, but more importantly, to respect our environment and to contribute to support each other to succeed in this world. I'd like to, in particular, talk about a subsection of the population, which is women. And since I'm on an all-girl team, I'd like to say how we have historically been excluded in education from becoming world-class researchers in science and technology and math, and how one of our values should be to contribute to girls' education in STEM, and that we should pursue the commitment of everyone here, and this is a global education and skills forum, to ensure that all girls have access to quality STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. Similarly, I'd like to say that countries like mine that have opted for curriculum and teaching values that are divisive and that are specific to a country and that pitch other countries against theirs never succeed in the long run. And their peoples always end up suffering. In this 21st century, where we're more interconnected than ever, we need to build the consensus, to garner the resources, and to build the capacity to ensure that certain important and crucial values are shared and are taught in our schools so that our youth are equipped to defend themselves from autocratic leaders, to defend other countries who may face autocratic leaders, and to protect the environment in which we live and that we cherish so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our four speakers. I'd like to open to the floor now, please. Thank you, gentlemen in the front. I think there are some microphones.
A future in which the fascists had won the Second World War, and the other was a case study looking at the abuse of values education within the context of Latin America. In the context of fascism, I'm not convinced that the global values espoused within a fascist superstate would necessarily be ones that we'd want to see inculcated. So my question is to both sides, do you have confidence that the very significant power of deciding what values should be inculcated within our schools is one that should ever be ceded to the state, particularly given how that could be abused?
Who would like to respond first?
Well, I guess the simple answer is no. I don't have confidence that ceding the values to the state would make sense. I do think as a global community, we need to define what are these shared values. And we have institutions around the world, the UN, the United Nations, for Latin America and the Caribbean. We have the Organization of American States, who are responsible for, to some extent, ensuring that these shared values are respected and abided by all world leaders. So I am very pleased also right now that the new Secretary General of the Organization of American States, for example, is trying to push for the democratic charter to be applied to Venezuela. And this is, important to have these institutions and these globally agreed values. Oh no, they've never been infallible. It's taken 16 years, for example, for the OAS to declare that Venezuela is not a democratic country. So certainly, but I think it is better than not having these institutions.
Thank you. Someone from the four side? Someone from the four side like to respond? I think the question was to both sides.
I agree with her answer.
Thank you very much. Okay, another question, please.
Yes, thank you very much.
Could I just ask you if you can introduce who you are and which side you'd like to direct your question to, or both?
Of course. My name is Ayub, and I have two questions, if I may. One very quick to the speaker on behalf of the organizers is that why is it teachers and policymakers that are talking on behalf of young learners on what we need to learn or to be taught rather than us being there telling you about what we think we should be learning in terms of values, global or national? And my second question is to Professor Sadiq. Your argument is based around questioning the existence of something called universal values or global values. And that is something that we could simply invalidate by going through research, scientific research that showed significant measures of certain values that are being naturally developed among human beings all over cultures, such as empathy, justice with a veil of ignorance or not. etc. There is significant measurements of values that all human beings, as human beings, naturally develop. I want to get that question back to you now. What are the national values you think should be prioritized over global values and are mutually exclusive with those? Because I can list down some global values, but can't find national values that don't work
Thank
in
you
that
very much.
context.
Thank
Thank you.
All right, I'll take that. I probably would have agreed with you circa 2014, and I definitely don't anymore. You just reminded me of a quote that says, "The more we love humanity in general, the less we appear to love people in particular." And I think that's what's happened with this airy-fairy, sugar-coated, grand global projects, is that we've lost touch with the individuals on the ground. Have you ever cleaned toilets in your school? You did. Where was that? That's right. That's a national value that I would like to see elsewhere. The Japanese do that as well. How many people have done that in globalized international schools? I doubt there were very many. So it's not for me to say which values need to be imposed on which countries, but there's certainly lots of pockets of excellence that can be copied by others voluntarily without the imposition from the top, because we're at the end of history, end of ideology, end of debate. This is the one set of rules that have been agreed by treaty, and therefore it's going to be imposed on everybody. We don't need to do that. You can just tell us what it is, and the rest of us can choose to apply them if we need to.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions at the back. A lady at the back there, please.
Hi, I'm Sonal, and I'm from India. I have a question for the ladies team. Beautiful arguments, and you painted a lovely picture. My question is, I'm from a country that has a huge population. It is still considered a third world country, though we don't consider ourselves that. The world does. So when you decide on these, quote, global values, what kind of weightage does my country get in deciding which global value is, which of our values makes it among the global values? Or do we have to adopt a set of values decided for us by the, quote, developed countries or the, quote, countries that have global citizens? So that is something that bothers me.
Thank you for your question. I think underpinning some of the exchanges here is, I think, a confusion between values and policy settings. And in countries around the world, there will be different policies, different views about whether or not cleaning toilets in school is a good educative exercise, and we'll come to conferences and we'll talk about that, and evidence will be produced. But when we're talking about values, I think we're talking about a bigger concept, about the things that we can share as human beings, which really define us as human. So our conception is not that someone comes from the outside and with tablets of stone lays it down and says these are global values, but rather from the grassroots up, we search for a consensus about the things in which we all can believe. And we've done this in the past. I'm sure that we as a group could look through documents like the Convention on the Rights of the Child and look at the values that drove that document, that say every child is precious, a child in Bangladesh, a child in Australia, every child is precious and is entitled to certain things, and we could all give assent to that as a global value to which we aspire. So no imposition from the outside, no disjuncture between wealthier countries and poorer countries, but a coming together in a consensus-driven process about what it is that we say are the universal things that bind us together as humans on this planet.
Another question from over here. Thank you.
Lena from Bahrain, and my question is for the gentleman. Well, either one of you. So I think, we would probably all agree that we will always have a difference of opinion. There'll always be political polarity, or in more extreme cases, fundamentalism. Do you agree? So in that case, isn't it more important that because we're never going to be like-minded, that at least we're like-hearted, and that there are these common global values that bind us, and whatever those are, if we just look at most religions and spiritual teachings, the bedrock or the wisdom of all religions is be a good person, be kind, be compassionate, and about our interdependence. And you mentioned, and I agree with you on the notion of the individual rather than just the global kind of community. But doesn't a value like interdependence also benefit the individual, where, what I do affects my community as well as the rest of the world? So, thoughts?
Absolutely, and you make a very good point about faith. My own daughter goes to a Church of England school in England, and they have a poster in the hall which says, "God is too big to fit into any one religion." And I think that's a very powerful message that young students can live by and expand their sympathies by. But there's one other thing that I would say as well, and that is that when we talk about interdependence, of course we want to have interdependence and good relations between individual nations and cultures. But as well as that sort of horizontal good relation, I think it's really important we also have good vertical relations as well. All of us will have to have somewhere that we're going to call home, even if it's not permanent. And within that place that we call home, I think it's critically important that everyone is included. And I think the danger sometimes, as Professor Siddiqui has mentioned, is that you sometimes have a thin crust of individuals whose loyalty is not so much to home and to others, but to self-advancement and the elite. And one of the things that national values can do is that they can remind us that actually our responsibility is to use our talents if we have them, and our leadership position if we have them, to help those less fortunate people, and often those less fortunate people who are closest to us first of all, and by so doing enlarge the sphere of sympathy, which means that we're being genuinely open-hearted in the way that you talk about.
We have someone from over here, the lady here.
Hi, my name's Kamaria, and I am Zanzibari, Omani, grew up in England, living in the UAE. So my questions to both parties, well, sort of a question. In the ideal world, we would have the global values where everyone has one set of values that we all follow and we all work towards. But in reality, and I'm wondering why we decided that we should have global values or national values. Why can't we have both? And hearing both arguments, it's almost like you're kind of agreeing in some points or a lot of the points. So why can't we have all the values? I mean, national values are important, but if we concentrated on having just national values, there's a lot of things that can happen which would exploit a certain group of people. And if we have global values, then we'd have countries that lose their nationalism, which is also important.
Good question. Is it either or can we have both? Can I ask the fours to respond first, please?
Yes, you can have both, but I think that what Professor Siddiqui and I would both believe is that the balance in the last couple of years has shifted in a way that has caused discontent, and we've seen that discontent bubble over in sometimes ugly fashion. That ultimately, of course you can balance the two, but if it's the case that those people in any society who operate successfully at a global level forget about those who share the same patch of earth and share the same traditions and share the same political system, then that rupture, that growing gap, that growing inequality between fortunate and unfortunate, rich and poor, can create problems in society. And those problems in society can lead to precisely the backlash against cooperation that means that people across the world are less secure. So, of course, they need to be in balance. Our view is that perhaps it's time to shift the balance a little bit back towards people thinking about how they can make democratic nation states genuinely accountable and the leaders within them listening leaders.
And a response from this side, please.
So again, we agree. I think it's a different of how we weight them. I would say, because of my experience observing countries that have gone too far on the national value, ignoring some global values that we probably all share, that's sometimes a bigger risk, and that's why we need an agreement of what are those global values to which all nations should aspire to meet, and that are, as my teammate said, broad values and not policies, and that at the national level we establish policies. I do want to add one point, which I think is important to distinguish values as they are taught in terms of ideals as individuals and what we can do to contribute to our own futures and those of others in our society, and then commerce and globalization and how that gets translated into policies that it's a different concept. So I just wanted to make that.
Thank you. We have a question just over here. Can we have a mic up this end, please?
Madam Speaker, hi. This is a question for my dear friend Lutfi Siddiqui.
Be nice.
Lutfi, I might be a distant second to you in terms of the global profile that you mentioned. I grew up in South Africa, and as a young boy there, I recollect very clearly some really strong values, values which were passed on from generation to generation quite proudly. Unfortunately, those values didn't really agree with the 80% of the population on the other side. And if it wasn't for a strong global force, which acted as a fulcrum here to achieve the outcome that we saw later in '94, my future might have been quite different. So, question to you is, how do we reconcile that going forward?
The global force that you would have felt was the pursuit of national interest by people who held values that they would have liked to see in your country. You know, we hear trade, not aid. The overseas development officers everywhere keeps on saying that. It's aid is pursued because of national interest. Every child is not worth the same. It's a nice statement to make, but if you look at the amount of money that's spent on every child around the world and how much of it is distributed from one part of the world to the other, the implied valuation is that every child is not the same. So what I put to you is that it's the pursuit of national interest, clearly embedded in the national values in another country, that would have resulted in the intervention that caused changes in South Africa.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, the lady in the back there.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to put my question to both sides. My name's Christine Causey, and you can hear from my accent I'm Australian. My question actually comes to, we've talked global and national, but in many of our countries, including the UAE, and I'm delighted to be here for the first time, and Australia and the UK, certainly the USA, Canada, many, many countries, it is actually within our country that we are experiencing variation in values between different communities at a local level. I'd be very interested in hearing your comments on national diversity in values.
Could I ask the against side to go first?
Thank you for that question. And once again, I think in our pursuit here for global values, we're not talking about a tablet of every belief that people would hold. And so, of course, within societies and between nations, there will be differences in views. There are in Australia, our own country, where people will have different views and value sets, different religions, different outlooks on the world. But, and this was an intervention from the room further down here, when you actually try and distill what it is that can bring people together in a unanimous way, there is a sense of valuing each other as human beings, treating each other with respect, not discriminating against people, allowing people to live their lives free of the fear of violence against their person, the sorts of things that we have written and reduced into international conventions. Because whether or not you are an Indigenous Australian, or whether or not you are a citizen of the UAE, or whether or not you are a citizen of the United Kingdom, it is possible to give assent to those values as values we should all hold dear, and to campaign as one when those values are offended against, the way they were when we had the example of apartheid South Africa raised.
I think you're absolutely right, and Julia reinforced this to say that there are sometimes problems within any nation state where you have different communities, different values, and sometimes discrimination or repression, or sometimes even just a failure adequately to communicate and to understand what each individual community wants. But I would contend that those countries which have been most successful in reconciling and in overcoming differences are those countries which have institutions which command the loyalty of everyone because they make power accountable. So whether it is the United Kingdom's parliamentary tradition or Australia's, whether it is the way in which in Canada or in India you can have a prime minister who, whatever the bitter partisan battles that brought them to power, commands the allegiance of the country and is capable also of bringing different communities together and making sure that they agree a budget, making sure that they agree a distribution of resources, making sure that they agree a transfer of money to the poor. That's what works. Now, it might be lovely if we could replicate that at a global level, but one of the concerns I would have is that anyone who would exercise power at a global level could never properly be held accountable in the way that leaders of even vast nation states like India and America are held accountable by a shared understanding of the institutions which ensure that democracy in both of those great nations works.
Thank you. I'm going to close the questions there. Thank you very much for great questions and fantastic responses from our four debaters. I'd now like to ask the four sides to propose the motion again for 3 minutes, and then I'll turn to the opposition.
So this is how financial bubbles start. There's always a kernel of truth behind the valuation of something. You know, this is cheap, you should buy it. These are the fundamentals. Look at the relative value and look at, you know, what's wrong with everyone in the US owning property? What's wrong with subprime? Let's go for it. And then over time, when it's unchallenged, it overreaches itself. It overstretches itself. And I think we're now at that part of overreach where certainly the last year or two should give us pause for thought. Are we in bubble territory? Are you telling us to go further into bubble territory? Or is it time for pause and give some more weight to those local, community, and national values? Values that we have neglected for a while because we've told everybody, sorry, you can't change that, because that's been agreed globally. We're going for ever closer union, and that ship has sailed. Well, that ship hasn't sailed, then I think we need to set course towards national right now. And unfortunately, the bubble, the charming salespeople selling the bubble are doing that with this opium of oratory that we now need to really get off of. And I would rather we reinforce in our children the value of valuing community. There's a reason why it used to be called civics. The lady there mentioned religious scriptures. Almost all of them say, charity begins at home, then the neighbors, and then you draw concentric circles and you get to further and further out. And if through that process you get to global, that's just fine. What we don't need is this managerial class of overlords that have nothing native or authentic to bring to the mix. If you've got children that are educated in the values of their nation and they get together and it's a potluck, everyone brings a dish to the party, that's great. But if you're telling them to assimilate and lose their own identity as they're assimilating it, then I don't think that is a sustainable outcome. I want the same outcome that the side opposite wants. I don't want Nazism, Second World War, all of that. But ask yourself whether today we are a little bit closer to that because of that overreach, albeit started as a well-intentioned progressive movement. If that overreach has now put us in a place where we need to roll back slightly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to conclude by actually reverse engineering this proposition. We've been talking about what we should teach children, global values or national values. Let's conclude by reflecting on what children would be teaching us if they were in this room. I was in Malawi earlier this year with the global celebrity Rihanna, and I watched as schoolgirls in Malawi screamed and squealed and sang the words of her songs. They are globally connected citizens. Whether or not we want them to be, whether or not we think they should be, they are globally connected citizens. They know not just the global culture of celebrity, they know what is happening in all parts of the world. They have that information instantaneously. And it is fanciful to think that these young people, as they grow, as the world is more and more connected, as the lives they lead touch on more and more places on the planet, that these will be people that you are able to say to, no, these are the values of Malawi. If you move across a border or two, then you'll have to have different values. If you go to the UK for university, different values again. If you then get a job in the UAE, oops, there'll be another set of national values. It can't work, it won't work. The history of humanity is taking us towards a more globalised and interconnected planet. The values that used to guide us in our family homes and our village now need to be the values of the planet overall, because everyone is our neighbour. That's why we should be teaching our children global values.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now is the time for the second vote. I'm going to read the motion again. This House believes that schools should teach national values over global ones. A, for, B, against, and C, undecided. I have 15 seconds. Okay. So we have an increase in the for. So I think anyone can declare a victory. But thank you so much to all of our speakers, Lutfi Siddiqui, Michael Gove, Julia Gillard, and Emiliana Vegas. Thank you very much.